But joining me now is someone who does know what they're talking about, and that's former University of Southern Queensland Dean of Business, a current pastor and company director, and economist, Dr. Rod St Hill. Rod, thanks so much for joining me today. You've heard my take. How do you rate Jim Chalmers' budget? Will it get inflation down? Will it make a difference to struggling households?
Well, if I was grading him, he'd probably do well to get a 4 out of 10. And the short answer to your question about inflation is no. This is not a budget that will reduce inflation. At best, it won't make it worse, but I suspect it will. And of course, monetary handouts to people as a sop to inflation is very temporary and will itself, as you've rightly said, actually add to inflationary pressures. So my estimation, this budget has done very, very little to tackle the major issues. The big issue is that household disposable income is falling. There was a publication by the Reserve Bank in January this year that showed that after we've paid our taxes, after we've paid out interest on our mortgages and other loans, our disposable income has actually fallen by 5.5% since 2022. Wow. And that's making adjustments for inflation as well. So households are going backwards quite rapidly, and this budget has done absolutely nothing to address that. The other issue which worries me a lot is that labour productivity is actually falling. GDP per worker hour actually fell last year by around 1%, and by around 0.4%. If we're going to have much of a future in terms of improving the real disposable income of households, we need to get productivity up and we need to get prices down. Unfortunately, I don't think this budget does anything to address those most fundamental issues.
Well, Rod, that's a pretty grim picture. So the government's approach has been to, as you say, hand out money to give that sort of sop in supposed cost of living relief. But if the government was really serious about lifting productivity and household disposable income, what should it be doing in the current environment, given that our debt is so high? If a government was really acting in our best interest, would it actually cut debt, for instance, and address some of these structural issues, which might perhaps cause a little bit of short-term pain to get us back on a right track again?
The big issue is always in the transition, and there are always losers in the transition, and the losers are often the poorer people among us. So that's the big issue that needs to be confronted by government. For me, the big issue, I think, is that the size of government is growing. You alluded to that in your introductory remarks, Lyle. The tax take will rise to nearly 26% of our GDP. In Australia, government overall represents about 38%, will grow to around 40% of total GDP. That's around about the same as it is in the United States. It's a lot higher in places like Canada and the UK. But one of the things that really bothers me as an economist is that when you look at very long-term data, there is an inverse relationship between the size of government and economic growth. So as governments increase social welfare handouts and subsidies on power bills and so on, the size of government is growing, and that makes it ever more difficult to raise economic growth. In the very long term, we're talking here about generations, we need economic growth. That's the only way we have any guarantee of keeping people out of poverty.
So Rod, how can that be achieved then? And we saw back in 2014 when Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey tried to rein in and start to address the size of government issues and cut some of the handouts. And Hockey said, the age of entitlement is over. Now, there was a massive backlash to that budget, and governments of both persuasions have been gun-shy ever since. But is that the sort of hard medicine that's needed to trim the size of government and to get productivity up and get the economy growing again?
Yes, it is. It's unequivocal. Yes, it is. In fact, the last budget that I was happy with was the 2014 budget. But I was gobsmacked at the response by the media, which was highly irresponsible. And of course, most of the initiatives in that budget were scuttled by the Senate. And I've never quite forgiven Clive Palmer for what his party did, whatever it was called back then, in the Senate, particularly to scuttle the co-payment on Medicare, which was very reasonable and very, very modest and would have helped save Medicare. But anyway, that's history. I think we've been very poorly served by governments ever since then, and it just seems to get worse and worse. And this budget would be the worst since 2014. We need to get back to those kinds of budgets. And but I think it's going to take a massive dose of good leadership and education of the public. And in particular, the public, I think, needs to learn that journalists don't necessarily know what they're talking about, particularly those who have graduated from universities in the last 10 or 15 years.
So, Rod, are you saying that if we had a budget like one that we really do need as a nation to trim that government spending, to rein back the handouts, I guess the thing that everyone's scared about, and this is what the media egg up, is that there will be people hurt by it. There'll be lots of pain. There'll be, carnage. There's a lot of hyperbole around, the losers out of budgets like this. So no one wants to create losers and create, I guess, media headlines on having people on television, crying about how the government has hurt them. Is that all overblown? Would it be as bad as that if there was sort of a measured approach to reducing the size of government?
What we really need, I believe, is somebody who's got a 25-year vision for this nation. These issues are actually issues that stretch over generations. And the problems that we have today have actually crept up on us for long, long periods of time. Really going back, I would suggest, to the end of the Second World War. It was really around about that time that governments took on the responsibility for significant social welfare expenditure, and it's just been growing ever since. It's inefficient in the sense that what we're really doing is transferring income from some people to others, and we build very large bureaucracies in order to do that. As the size of the government grows, as the size of the bureaucracy grow, so too our freedoms are gradually emasculated. It starts in the economic arena, and we certainly saw that up until at least the early 1980s, when the Hawke-Keating government undertook some very courageous economic policy changes to correct for mistakes that had been going on for probably 50 years. And some of that was also continued with the Howard Costello government, but since then, we really haven't had the kind of leadership that we actually need to lead Australia to a different future. And we must have it. We must have it, because in the long term, this is not sustainable.
How much time do we have, Rod, to turn things around? Our gross debt's about to crack $1 trillion. How serious is it? How much time have we got before we have a government that is able to show the sort of leadership that you're talking about to rein this in?
Well, look, I'm an economist. I'm not a political commentator. I really don't know. I just don't know who or how we could get the kind of leadership we really need. It's courageous leadership. It has to be leadership that looks well past the next one or two elections. And I think the big issue has to be to tackle the transition. There are always winners and losers in the short term before the long-term gains trickle down to most people in the economy. And and look, honestly, I don't have all the answers there. I know where we need to be, but there's a lot of uncertainty about who will be the losers in the short term and exactly what is the best way to deal with it. I suspect that one of the things we must do is to greatly simplify both the tax system and the social welfare system. At the moment, well over 60%, in fact, it's 67%, about 2/3 of the total tax revenue raised by the government is taxes on production. Those are company taxes and the like, plus income tax. Now, those kinds of taxes are a disincentive for us to actually go out, get a job, or to be entrepreneurial and create new jobs by creating new businesses. there needs to be a significant shift in the burden of taxation away from production to consumption. Now, we've got arrangements with the GST, for example, that make it almost impossible to shift our reliance away from income taxes of various kinds and onto consumption taxes. I think that was one of the tragedies of John Howard's agreement with Meg Lees when the GST was first brought in, and the way in which basically all the federal government does is raise revenue, which they hand over to the states. So we've got massive problems there as well.
Yeah, look, Rod, this is a big issue of policy and obviously vital to the future of our nation. But look, that's all we've got time for today. Unfortunately, I could talk to you for hours about this because it really is something that is hurting everyone. The cost of living squeeze, and sadly, what we're seeing out of this budget is no solution to it, and probably more pain down the track. Dr. Rodson Hill, thanks so much for your time today.